Unaware that the black woman is a CIA spy, white police officers frame her. In court, the truth blows up. Two policemen stopped a black woman late at night in a sleepy Virginia hamlet and accused her of a crime she had not committed. What started off as a normal stop swiftly turned into something much more sinister. A well-thought-out setup. However, these officers were unaware that the woman they were targeting was not just any woman. She had the ability to destroy everything they believed they were in control of. This story takes a startling turn that nobody anticipated, revealing a network of deceit and corruption before coming to a catastrophic conclusion that would rock the entire police force to its foundation. Arlington, Virginia, had a calm night. The rare automobiles zipped down the vacant roads, and the hum of street lights flickered above the walkways. Talia Porter drove through the affluent neighborhood in her beautiful black SUV, her hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel. She looked at her timepiece. It was a little after midnight. She had a slight sense of accomplishment despite the lengthy day. She had everything she needed for a clean getaway, and her time as an undercover agent in this small village was coming to an end. She paused as she got closer to a silent junction, her keen eyes catching the slight shine of a reflective stop sign. Years of experience as a field operator had sharpened Talia's attention to detail. With solid hands on the wheel, she stopped completely and turned left onto the next street. Her rearview mirror reflected the blue and red lights that flashed behind her a few moments later. The silence of the night was broken by the shrill cry of a siren. Talia didn't feel her heart pounding. She had been prepared for this kind of situation. Rather, her breathing became calm and her thinking sharpened. The squad car was approaching, its headlights creating lengthy shadows on the dashboard as she looked into the mirror. She maneuvered her vehicle to the side of the road, switched off the engine, and reached into her glove box to get her license and registration with a composed demeanor. Just behind her, the patrol car came to a stop, its lights still flashing. She could make out the figures of two officers leaving, moving purposefully. First to arrive was the driver, a towering, square-jawed man with a commanding presence. He was closely followed by his stockier, shorter colleague. Their badges shone in the streetlights as they wore the Arlington Police Department's navy blue uniforms. As they approached, Talia took note of their names: Officers Mark Sullivan and Brandon Carter. Officer Carter said, "Good evening, ma'am," with a tone of authority that he had perfected. Leaning slightly, he shone his flashlight into the window, illuminating her face and inside with the beam. "Do you know why I stopped you this evening?" Talia met his gaze without hesitation and maintained a neutral look. "No," she said evenly. "Officer, I stopped completely at the junction and wasn't speeding." A tiny condescending smirk tugged at the edges of Officer Carter's lips as they twitched. He added, "Actually, you didn't stop at that sign back there. A moving violation, that is." Talia's forehead wrinkled just a bit, but she remained calm. "Officer," she remarked in a controlled but forceful tone, "I'm positive I stopped." Carter cut in, his tone tightening, "License and registration, if you're mistaken." With calm, careful movements, Talia handed him the documents without hesitation. She had no desire for needless escalation. Carter looked over her documents, his gaze resting on her license. She sensed his interest in her, the slight change in his manner as he came to terms with who she was. "Local address of Virginia plate," he said almost to himself, then more loudly. "Do you reside here?" Talia gave a nod. "Indeed." Officer Sullivan, who had been hovering close to the back of her car, yelled, "Carter, you may want to give this place another look." Carter stood up straight and returned Talia's papers without saying anything. He told her to stay in the car and then turned to meet his accomplice at her SUV's trunk. As Talia observed them in her side mirror, her jaw tensed. Sullivan's voice was low and conspiratorial as he pointed to something. She felt a twinge of anxiety when the two officers shared a look after Carter nodded. It was a keen, intuitive warning rather than terror, which Talia seldom ever experienced. Carter came back to her window a few moments later, his face suddenly serious. "Get out of the car, please." Talia's voice was calm, yet inquisitive as she cocked her head slightly. "Officer, may I ask why?" Carter said, "We have reason to suspect that you are in possession of illegal substances." He spoke in a clipped, nearly practiced voice. Talia squinted her eyes. "Illegal drugs?" She said it again. "I believe you have erred." Carter motioned for her to leave, saying, "We'll see about that." With a smug expression on his face, Sullivan was already waiting close to the rear of the car. Talia stifled a groan, opened the door, and went outside. She moved with purpose and without hurry, as if she had endless time. With her hands by her sides, she watched as Sullivan theatrically raised her trunk and pointed to a little, unlabeled bag that was ostentatiously placed close to the edge. Sullivan remarked mockingly, "There it is. A package of powdery bliss, you know?" Talia's countenance was unreadable as her gaze shifted to the bag and then back to the officers. But inside her head, everything was being cataloged quickly. She was certain that the bag had not been with her when she left her home. It was a setup. Carter's grin widened as he stepped closer. "Do you have anything to share with us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curled into the tiniest trace of a smile, a deliberate, subdued look that was neither guilty nor afraid. "I'll reserve my remarks for the proper context," she stated. Carter laughed, obviously taking her composure as a sign of cockiness. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute, so you'll get your opportunity." Talia's eyes were unwavering and steady as Sullivan proceeded to cuff her. Her voice had a calm intensity that caused Sullivan to pause for a half-second before he snapped the cuffs into place. "You're making a big mistake," she murmured softly. Carter led her to the squad car and replied, "Yeah, we'll see. Let's test your self-assurance before a judge." Talia stared out the window as they drove away, her thoughts already racing through her possibilities. The two officers had no idea who they were dealing with, even if they might have thought they had just made an easy arrest. There was a tense stillness on the ride to the station. The only noises were the engine's hum and the police radio's sporadic crackle. Talia sat in the patrol car's back seat with her hands cuffed behind her and a blank expression on her face. Her face was briefly shadowed by the fluorescent light from the lamps that passed by, but her eyes never left the road. Her thoughts were incisive and purposeful within, like a puzzle being put together piece by piece. Every second of the interaction played back in her head. The planted bag, the policeman's arrogant self-confidence, and the non-existent stop sign. It was a planned, practiced act of corruption rather than a haphazard one. These were decisions rather than errors. Officer Carter's lips curled into a slight smirk as he looked at her in the rearview mirror. He broke the silence by remarking, "You don't seem too worried." He sounded mocking, as though he were trying to get her to do something. Through the mirror, Talia's eyes met his, unwavering and steady. "Must I be?" Carter shook his head and laughed. "Lady, you're either brave or foolish. It seldom lasts long in a holding cell, despite the fact that I have witnessed several people act tough." Talia remained silent. She didn't have to. She was all too familiar with individuals like Carter, who were accustomed to having power, to breaking the law, and to leaving without repercussions. She allowed him to think he was in charge for the time being. The illusion would be short-lived. When they got to the station, the cops working the night shift were relaxing behind their desks, drinking coffee and having soft conversations. Carter and Sullivan ushered Talia inside, where the peeling paint on the walls and the scuffed linoleum floors were glared at mercilessly by the fluorescent lights. Carter said loudly and boldly, "We got ourselves a big one tonight." With interest sparked, the other officers looked up. With a dramatic flourish, Sullivan threw the powder bag onto the counter. Sullivan stated that he had caught her red-handed. She seemed to have run more than stop signs. Talia kept quiet as she looked around the room. She took note of the cops' informal companionship, the arrangement of the desks, and the positioning of each camera. Everyone knew everyone at the little station, which was a network of unwritten codes and shared secrets. Carter uncuffed her and gestured for her to put her hands on the ink pad as they led her to a fingerprinting station. She obeyed silently, moving in a composed and methodical manner. The younger, weary-eyed officer on duty at the station paused as he looked at her, as if he could sense something was wrong. "Name?" he inquired in a tone that was almost contrite. "Talia Porter," she said politely. "What is your occupation?" For a time, Talia paused to think over her response. "Consultant," she murmured at last. It was truthful enough to avoid plain deceit, yet imprecise enough to evade investigation. The younger officer gave a nod and went on typing, clearly uncomfortable. But Carter and Sullivan were unaware, leaning on the counter and laughing softly. "Do you like the show?" Talia's question sliced like a razor through their laughter. For a moment, both men's smugness wavered as they turned to face her. Carter's tone darkened as he remarked, "You have a clever mouth. After spending a night in jail, let's see how humorous you are." The metal seat fastened to the wall provided little solace in Talia's chilly and poorly lit cage. The concrete floor was covered in lengthy shadows from the bars, and fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. Her posture was unwavering as she sat on the bench with her back straight. The sound of the door slamming behind her reverberated along the still hallway. Carter hovered for a minute, observing her with a mixture of interest and contempt. He replied, almost in a conversational tone, "You don't seem like the type to get involved in this kind of thing. Don't worry, though. The courts enjoy a good heartwarming tale. They might be lenient with you." Talia's eyes met his as she cocked her head slightly. She continued, "Or maybe they'll see through yours," in a calm but abrasive tone that caused Carter to fidget uneasily. She was left alone in the cell as he walked away, muttering something beneath his breath. With a deep exhale, Talia leaned back against the chilly metal wall. She was aware that her next move needed to be exact. She fought for more than simply her personal liberation. She was going to reveal something considerably more significant. The low hum of the station's HVAC system was the only sound to disturb the cell silence. With years of experience in the field, Talia's patience allowed her to wait. She was aware that others would soon notice her absence, and there would be inquiries when it was. Her group would track her down. They did it every time. She had to act the part in the interim. The serene prisoner, the ordinary woman with nothing to conceal. However, every second that went by was a new chance to watch and learn. She observed the rhythms and rituals of the night shift policeman footfall as they passed her cell. She listened for the crackle of the radio and the soft beep of the station's computers. Every little detail counted. She would be prepared when the time came. Carter and Sullivan were enjoying hot coffee in the station's break area as their laughter filled the little room. Sullivan shook his head and remarked, "She believes she's untouchable. Have you seen her face? Not even a hint of fear." With a sneer on his lips, Carter said, "Yeah, well, that'll change. In the system, she is now simply another name. No one will delve too far. We have everything we need to," Sullivan noted. "The proof is unquestionable." The young officer from the processing desk was hovering close by, his eyes darting toward the holding cells, his face pallid, but neither of them saw him. He didn't feel comfortable with the circumstances, but he didn't say anything. Interrogating senior officers was not just discouraged, but also risky in this station. Talia closed her eyes and remained in her cell, breathing steadily. She didn't sleep even though the hours passed. She didn't have to. The moment when everything would fall apart was getting closer by the minute. Talia was the storm's silent eye as it approached. Talia's holding cell had a narrow window high up that let in a thin sliver of light. A new day began as the sun created a subdued glow on the chilly concrete walls. Talia was sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed as though she were meditating, and she hadn't moved much during the night. During missions, she rarely luxuriated in sleep. This made her thinking sharper, always anticipating and calculating. From the corridor outside her cage came the muffled buzz of voices. The day shift officers were starting their procedures, and the station was starting to come alive. She paid close attention, picking up on the unique voices and footsteps, small clues that gave her greater insight into the staff. The cell block door was unlocked with a loud buzz, and then the sound of heavy boots reverberated down the hallway. Officer Sullivan showed up in front of Talia's cell with a clipboard and his trademark smirk, but Talia didn't bat an eye. "Good morning, sunshine," he remarked, his tone brimming with sarcastic joy. "Do you get enough sleep? Or did you not think the cot was 5-star enough?" Talia looked at him without saying anything, and her quiet disturbed him more than he would like to acknowledge. He looked down at his clipboard and moved his weight a little. He tapped the paper with his pen and added, "You have a bail hearing this afternoon. However, I wouldn't raise your expectations between us. Drug dealers are not treated very well by judges in this area. Her gaze was composed but uncompromising as she cocked her head. "That's good to know," she said quietly. Sullivan scowled, his smirk's assurance wavering momentarily. He took a step back and cleared his throat. He murmured, "Enjoy your breakfast," then pivoted on his heel and left. As he vanished down the corridor, Talia leaned back against the wall and watched him. They were beginning to exhibit the fractures in their facade. She only needed a bit more time. Young, enthusiastic, and just out of the academy, Officer James Keller stood at the front desk, watching Sullivan go confidently through the station. Keller continued to feel uneasy about the entire situation. In his few months on the job, he had processed scores of arrests, but this one felt unique. Keller had never seen anyone act like the suspect, Talia Porter. She wasn't afraid, but she also wasn't belligerent or defiant. Her composed manner and her thoughtful speech were unusual. Afterward, there was the medication bag. Sitting there in the trunk like a wrapped gift was almost too handy. With his fingers lingering over his keyboard, Keller paused. He was aware of the station's unspoken norms. Senior officials weren't questioned by you, but he was unable to get rid of the doubt that was eating away at him. He looked at the live feed of the hallway outside Talia's cell on the security monitors over his desk. Her face was unreadable as she sat motionless as a statue on the bench. Talia made her move while Keller struggled with his conscience, a tiny spark of resolve flickering inside him as he bit his lip. Her eyes were focused on the camera outside her cell, but her hands were carelessly resting on her lap. It was an old model that had probably been neglected and was out of date. She assumed that modern surveillance was not a top priority for the station's finances. She shifted gently on the bench, her motions deliberate yet subtle. After waiting until the hallway was free, a tiny, unobtrusive tracker, common for CIA agents in the field, was concealed in the hem of her garment. With a barely audible click, she activated the device by pressing her hand against the fabric. The tracker sent a beacon, a discreet signal that would reach her squad in a matter of seconds. They would know what to do without her having to talk or give an explanation. Carter and Sullivan were giggling over the morning paper in the break room as they sipped their coffee. Carter shook his head and remarked, "I think she's sitting in there thinking we're going to crack." They constantly believe they can talk their way out of a situation. Sullivan laughed. "She's going to have a harsh awakening, I guess. This case is obvious. We have the arrest report, the narcotics, and no witnesses. No one will come to her aid." With a contented smile, Carter reclined in his chair. "Do you know what I enjoy about my work? The consistency. You keep seeing the same kinds. They never are, even though they believe they are smarter than us. Ignorant of the tempest that was simmering just outside their comprehension." Their laughter reverberated throughout the room. A dull phone buzzed faintly on a desk at a nearby workplace. The voice on the other line was calm, but authoritative, and a hand extended to answer it. "Signal received," said the voice. "Location verified. Putting resources into action." Talia closed her eyes for a time and laid her head back against the wall. In the background, she could practically feel the gears working and her team's calm precision mobilizing. She was getting closer to the inevitable reckoning by the second. With a tiny smile that conveyed peaceful conviction rather than excitement, she opened her eyes. What was about to happen was unknown to the officers. Officers were taking calls, filing reports, and chit-chatting over coffee as the station was a hive of morning activity. With the exception of Talia Porter and the two men who had planned her arrest, everything was going as usual. Today was a victory lap for Sullivan and Carter. In her holding cell, Talia sat still, her stance as calm as ever. She could make out glimpses of the station's activity through the bars, including brief conversations and the occasional passing shadow. But she didn't lose her concentration. When needed, she was able to blend in with the background and remain invisible until the precise moment when visibility was most important. Hours had passed since she issued her signal, and she had complete faith in her crew. She was aware that they wouldn't take immediate action, though. The timing was crucial. She had to plant the seeds of mistrust in the interim. Officer Keller's gaze flicked back to the holding cell monitors at the front desk. Something about Talia's manner bothered him, even if she hadn't moved much since she had arrived. It wasn't the resistance or fear he was used to seeing in prisoners. It was a calm assurance and serenity that seemed out of place for someone charged with narcotics trafficking. Keller opened her file on his computer, unable to get rid of his uneasiness. There was an odd lapse in her work history, but her address and driver's license details were clear. Her most recent position as an independent consultant was identified by the system without profit. Any additional information? Keller scowled, shrugged, and looked toward the break room, where Sullivan and Carter were giggling over donuts. It made his stomach turn to see how carefree they were. Keller chose to examine the arrest record more closely against his better judgment. He browsed the story that Carter and Sullivan had given him, clicking through the electronic documents. Keller read aloud while muttering to himself that he had been stopped for not yielding at a marked crossing. The driver was apprehensive when being questioned. Permission to search is given. Prohibited chemicals discovered in the car's trunk. The numbers didn't add up. He had been trained to spot patterns of dishonesty, and although the report appeared to follow protocol, it felt too neat, too predetermined. As the hours went by, Keller's internal struggle intensified. He was pacing close to the holding cells, looking more and more toward Talia's cell. At last, he summoned the bravery to speak. He paused just outside the bars and said, "Miss Porter." Talia raised her head, evaluating with her black eyes. "Indeed?" Keller put his hand on his belt and hesitated. "I simply wanted to ask, I guess. Did you truly agree to have your vehicle searched?" Talia studied him with a little inclination of her head. She could see the slight fractures in his determination and the doubt in his gaze. "Do you have any opinions, Officer Keller?" Her tone was calm but direct as she inquired. Keller took a deep breath. His voice trailed off as he said, "I'm just doing my job." Talia said, her eyes unwavering, "That's what they're counting on. Men like Sullivan and Carter depend on people like you to ignore them." Keller blushed and took a step back, mumbling something incomprehensible and then backing away along the corridor. However, Talia could see the turmoil carved into his features and the hesitancy in his stride. They had sown the seed. Meanwhile, outside an unremarkable structure in the center of Arlington, a simple black vehicle came to a stop. A man in a fitted suit emerged from inside, his steps methodical. Two more agents, each with a professional and vigilant manner, were by his sides. "When will the extraction be completed?" As they entered the building, one of the agents inquired. The man's countenance was unreadable as he looked at his watch. "When she signals, we'll move forward. We watch for now." Live feeds from the police station flickered over multiple monitors in a secure operations room. On one screen, Talia was sitting motionless in her cage. Another showed the front desk, where Keller was pacing back and forth in obvious agitation. One agent noted, "Looks like the kid's starting to crack." "Good," the man said. "When the time comes, we'll make advantage of it." Carter sipped his third cup of coffee while leaning back in his chair in the break room. "Did you see Keller earlier?" He addressed Sullivan. The child appeared to have seen a ghost. Sullivan shook his head and grinned, probably overanalyzing, having just graduated from the academy. Around the first significant case, they always become jittery. "I hope he doesn't start asking too many questions." Carter's voice grew gloomy. Sullivan gave a shrug. "Not important. She has no alibi, and the evidence is overwhelming. He can't prove anything, even if he gets nosy." Carter nodded, but his expression showed a slight hint of discomfort. It occurred to him for the first time that Keller's skepticism might spread. Tension in the station increased as the day went on. Talia sensed it, a subtle change in the atmosphere. She was aware that her group was observing, anticipating the ideal opportunity to act. Once more, albeit more slowly, Keller's footsteps reverberated down the corridor. His expression was confused as he hesitated outside her cage. He muttered, "You said they're counting on people like me. By that, what did you mean?" Talia's eyes remained fixed. She answered, "You understand exactly what I mean. What are you going to do about it, I wonder?" After giving her a long look, Keller turned to go, his shoulders stiff. The man in the suit was back in the operations room, watching the monitor as Keller retreated. A small smile appeared on his lips. He said, "He's close." Another shove. One of the agents gave him a quick look. Then, the man grinned broadly. After that, we flipped everything around. Keller sat at his desk and gazed at his computer while his fingers drummed against the edge. As his head swirled, the computer file on Talia Porter stayed open, the words hazy. Since the arrest, he had been experiencing an increasing knot in his chest. He could no longer avoid the fact that something wasn't right. Carter and Sullivan were still laughing in the break room, and his discomfort was exacerbated by their casual demeanor. The walls of the station pressed in like a silent witness to something unsaid, making it feel heavier than usual. Keller's mind drifted back to Talia's remarks in the holding cell. They're depending on that. She had spoken in a cool, collected tone, as though she knew exactly what buttons to push. Perhaps she did. Was she mistaken, though? As the hours passed, Keller's uncertainty transformed into silent determination. He had to find answers, but he couldn't risk being noticed. He was already being teased because of his reputation as a rookie. Any indication of disobedience could make him much more isolated. He snuck into the records archive after waiting for Carter and Sullivan to leave the room. Long shadows were formed across rows of file cabinets and computer terminals by the gentle buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead. With his hands shaking a little, Keller entered the system and looked for previous cases involving Carter and Sullivan. Their names appeared over and time again, linked to arrests that had an unsettlingly similar pattern. Narcotics charges that escalate from minor traffic infractions. People of color made up the majority of the defendants. The majority were found guilty. His chest knot grew tighter. Talia stayed motionless in her cell, her figure a picture of poise. She had been preparing her mind for times like this, when the stakes were high and the waiting was lengthy, for years. She saw Keller's shadow pass by her cell through the bars, his movements more measured now, his pace slower. She could feel his struggle, the battle going on inside of him. She was aware that he was on the verge of ending the pattern of unquestioning obedience that men like Sullivan and Carter relied on. She moved a little on the bench, allowing his attention to be drawn to her movements. He paused and looked at her. "Officer Keller," she stated in a quiet but firm voice. His palm gripped the wall's edge, as if it were a lifeline while he hesitated. "What?" His voice was low and almost defensive as he asked. "Have you not noticed something?" She tilted her head in question. "Something that isn't consistent." Keller took a deep breath. "I am unable to." His voice caught as he stopped. "I'm only attempting to fulfill my duties." "And what precisely is your job?" Talia pushed. "To obey commands? To turn a blind eye when you know something is amiss?" Keller's gaze darted down the corridor as his jaw tensed. He remarked, "You don't understand how things work around here." With an unblinking gaze, Talia answered, "I understand more than you think. I understand what it's like to feel stuck and that you have no other options. However, Kelly, you do. You can always choose." Her comments trailed Keller like a shadow as he left. With his fingers hanging over his keyboard, he went back to his desk. His gut turned with every new name he read as he gazed at the list of cases connected to Carter and Sullivan. And at last he decided. Keller's resolve solidified, and his fingers sped up as he opened a secure email channel and typed a message. He included a note in the case files he had located. "Please be advised that there is a problem with this station. There's no one else I can turn to. Please assist." His pulse thumping, he sent the message, which vanished into thin air. He had no idea who would get it or whether they would give a damn. However, it was the first step toward acting in accordance with his moral convictions. Carter rested his coffee cup on his knee as he sat back in his chair in the break room. "Have you seen Keller's strange behavior today?" He looked at Sullivan and asked. Sullivan gave a shrug. "Children are inherently strange. Will he betray us, or what?" Carter squinted his eyes and grinned. "Nevertheless, watch him. A newbie sticking his nose where it shouldn't be is the last thing we need." The station was bustling that afternoon when a plain black vehicle arrived into the lot. Talia's squad got ready for their next move inside the automobile. As intended, they had successfully intercepted Keller's email, and now they had the necessary information to move further. The team leader adjusted his tie and stated, "Let's make this clean. No needless interruptions. We must reveal this from within." The light glinted off their badges as they got out of the automobile. "FBI." As the door to the station opened and the agents entered her cell, Talia gave a small smile. From her position, she couldn't see them, but she didn't have to. She was aware that her crew had come. The storm has stopped building. It was present. As the main doors opened, the station's hum subsided into an uncomfortable silence. The agents entered with deliberate steps, their badges shining in the fluorescent lights, their black outfits immaculate. The leader, a tall, stern-faced man with graying hair, walked up to the front desk, his gaze sweeping the room with silent power. Officer Keller, who was sitting close by, stopped typing. His heart started pounding. He couldn't tell if it was relief or terror, or both. He observed the lead agent speaking softly enough for the cops around him to not hear him, leaning slightly over the desk. His hand automatically went to the radio on his shoulder as the desk sergeant, a large man with a rough manner, straightened up. "What's going on here?" With a cautious tone, he inquired. "Federal investigation," the agent said in a clipped, calm voice. "We urgently require access to your holding cells and records." As he looked at a nearby officer, the sergeant paused, his brow furrowing. Although the FBI's abrupt entrance was out of the ordinary, disruptive even, there was no established procedure for categorical rejection. "All right," he mumbled, pointing to the corridor. "Come with me." With sweaty palms, Keller observed the conversation from his desk. Although he knew in his heart that his email had caused this, he hadn't anticipated a response this quickly or in such a noticeable way. He glanced at Sullivan and Carter, who were standing close to the door of the break room. They were no longer laughing. Instead, they were whispering quietly and frowning. Keller's eyes briefly met Carter's, but the rookie swiftly averted his gaze to concentrate on his screen. The station's atmosphere had shifted, becoming heavy with a suffocating tension. The lead investigator, Agent Daniel Price, and his team entered a small, dark interrogation room. A second agent moved a cart filled with multiple hard disks and a portable server. Without any delay, they connected to the station's network and started searching through its digital archives. Price watched as file names and lines of code scrolled across the monitor while he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "Anything?" he inquired. A younger woman with keen eyes, the tech agent nodded. "Lots. There are numerous discrepancies in their case files. The same storylines, repeated arrests, and procedural flaws. This is systematic, not just poor policing." Price's mouth clenched. "Pull everything. Every document, report, and piece of proof connected to those two is what I want." Talia listened in her cage to the slight hum of activity outside the corridor. She sensed the change, the faint wave indicating her crew was there. The wait was nearly over. Her hands were on her lap as she moved slightly on the bench. Her wrists had small red traces from the cuff she had worn earlier, but she ignored them. She concentrated on the future, the time when the truth will be revealed. Carter, his coffee left on the counter, paced back and forth in the break room. With his arms folded and leaning against the wall, Sullivan observed his partner with increasing discomfort. "Do you believe this has to do with her?" At last, Sullivan asked in a hushed voice. Carter halted and gave him a stern look. "It's about her, of course. If not, why are the feds here?" Sullivan began to shift uneasily. "Do you believe they are aware?" Carter sneered, but his tone lacked conviction. "You know what? We don't know anything. We followed the text and all we did." Sullivan mumbled, "Yes. Yes." Agent Price and two other agents came out of the interrogation room. With the burden of proof in his hands, he held a folder full of printed reports. His face was unreadable as he moved through the station. He walked over to the bullpen and stared at Carter and Sullivan, who stopped talking in the middle of their sentences. With deliberate movements, the agents positioned themselves throughout the room like sentinels. Officers marked Sullivan and Brandon Carter. Price continued, his voice piercing the atmosphere like a dagger. "We have to talk to you." As he moved forward, Carter forced a smirk in an attempt to appear calm. "What's going on here?" His tone was informal as he inquired. "We have nothing to conceal." Price remained still. "Excellent. After that, you won't mind responding to a few inquiries." As the agents escorted the two policemen to the same questioning room they had been in only seconds before, the room went quiet. With his heart racing, Keller watched the scene play out. He could see the tightness in Sullivan's shoulders and the fissures that were beginning to appear in Carter's facade. The previously self-assured pair now resembled cornered animals. Talia's cell was visited by another agent a few minutes later. The agent entered with a respectful tone and a neutral expression as the door buzzed open. "You can leave, Miss Porter," he said. Talia stood, her steps deliberate and fluid. As she left the cell, she looked directly into the agent's eyes and gave a small nod. As she made her way to the front desk, the stifling weight of the station seemed to be lifted, and the hallway appeared to be brighter. They looked at each other for a moment as Talia walked past Keller's desk. He started to say something, but stopped because the words became stuck in his throat. She paused, looking him in the face. "Thank you," she whispered softly, with an implicit understanding in her voice. Keller's chest grew constricted. With his hands on the edge of his desk, he nodded slightly. For the first time since joining the force, he felt as though he had accomplished something significant, even though he had no idea what lay ahead. Carter and Sullivan were shortly followed by the sound of angry voices as the interrogation room doors closed behind them. Talia observed the agents carefully dissecting the officers' lies from the station's entrance. She had been waiting for this storm, and it was just getting started. Carter and Sullivan sat at a narrow metal table in the claustrophobic interrogation chamber, their attitudes rigid. Opposite them, with his hands resting on a pile of papers, was Agent Price. The low hum of the overhead light was the only sound to break the uncomfortable silence. With a controlled tone, Price started. "Should we go straight to the planted evidence? Or would you want to begin with the arrest report?" Sullivan winced, looking quickly at Carter. Carter's voice was full of indignation as he stated forcefully, "We don't know what you're talking about." Price remained unflinching. Rather, he opened the folder and took out several printed pictures. Images from the station's surveillance cameras, which showed Carter and Sullivan carrying the unmarked bag prior to Talia's car being inspected, were slid across the table one by him. Carter's jaw tensed, but he remained calm. "That proves nothing," he said. "We were gathering proof." Price leaned forward a little and arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because these timestamps contradict this, and we have audio recordings of your brief discussion about how simple it would be to frame her, thanks to Miss Porter's covert monitoring equipment." Sullivan's fists gripped the table's edge as he went pale. He stuttered, You can't use that. Entrapment is what that is." Price shook his head and grinned. "No, it's justice, but it's only the beginning. Records from your previous arrests have been retrieved. There are dozens of cases with strikingly similar trends. They're all being reviewed. Let me clarify one point, though. Today, you're not going to leave." Carter's shoulders slumped as his bluster started to fade. When the consequences of their deeds finally hit him, Sullivan buried his face in his hands. Keller, meantime, sat at his desk in the bullpen and watched the action. Earlier, he had been summoned inside the interrogation room to verify specifics on the station's procedures. The realization that someone from within had spoken out let him feel the weight of Carter and Sullivan's eyes for the first time. Keller stood with his hands shaking a little as the agents made their way back to the bullpen. He cleared his throat and walked over to Agent Price. "Now what?" he inquired. Price's gaze softened as he stared at him. "We're cleaning the house now, and you..." He stopped, looking at Keller's face. "You made the correct decision." With a slight sense of relief, Keller nodded. He had a sense of purpose for the first time since he joined the force. As Carter and Sullivan were released in handcuffs, Talia watched from the station's door. As they were led past their peers, the once cocky policemen now had a dejected appearance, their eyes sad. Officers exchanged astonished looks as the situation's reality set in, and the station was alive with silent whispers. Agent Price walked up to Talia with a polite but neutral smile. "Everything we need is here," he remarked. "This is the end of your work here." Talia nodded without losing her cool. "Excellent. Ensure that it adheres." Price gave a small smile. "It will." Talia felt a sense of finality when the cool air struck her face as she went outside. The quiet comfort of knowing justice had been done started to take the place of the weight she had been carrying for weeks. The community was rocked by the fallout from the investigations in the days that followed. With their faces displayed on every television, Carter and Sullivan's arrests made headlines. The cases connected to the officers' misbehavior were reopened, and Talia's accusations were officially withdrawn. A number of policemen resigned amid criticism as the station underwent a significant revamp. Keller, who is now considered a whistleblower, had conflicting responses from his peers, but he remained confident in his decision. A few weeks later, Talia was sitting on a park bench with a hot cup of coffee. Around her, the rustling of the fall leaves served as a reminder of change due to their vivid hues. The incident lingered in her thoughts even after she had returned to her quiet life, her job accomplished. In a rare moment of companionship, Agent Price joined her. He sat next to her and remarked, "You could have done this differently." Talia took a sip of her coffee and grinned. "And failed to see their expressions?" "Thank you, but no." Price gave a quiet laugh. "You have a talent for creating memorable experiences." For a while, they sat in friendly silence, temporarily forgetting the burden of their task. Although the storm had passed for Talia, her acts would continue to have an effect, guaranteeing that justice would be served, at least for the time being. Like wildfire, the news spread. Every local and national media outlet carried the story within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest. Corruption in the police is revealed. One major news site's strong headline read, "FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington." On repeat was footage of the officers being released in handcuffs. Their faces were gloomy, devoid of the haughtiness they had so brazenly displayed. Talia Porter's team made the deliberate choice to keep her name out of the press. Her involvement in revealing the truth had to take a back seat to the station's structural problems and the officers' conduct. That was how she liked it. She was more concerned with results than with celebrity. Carter and Sullivan sat opposite their attorneys in a windowless, sterile interrogation chamber at a federal detention facility. The harsh truth of their circumstances had replaced their conceit, which had melted into despair. Falsifying reports, fabricating evidence, and abusing their power in several instances were among the numerous accusations made against them. Sullivan mumbled, his voice trembling, "This is bad. They have all the data, audio, and video. How do we proceed?" Typically the more self-assured of the two, Carter sat quietly. He tightened his jaw. Finally, he answered, "We fight it," but his voice lacked conviction. However, their attorneys were pessimistic. The public outcry had already shifted the scales against them, and the pile of evidence was insurmountable. Their only hope of escaping decades behind bars was to enter into plea deals. The consequences persisted back at the Arlington Police Department. Higher-ups rushed to disassociate themselves from the issue as internal investigations found other cops engaged in similar tactics and resignations flooded in. In a press conference, the police chief emphasized his dedication to reform and openness. However, the department's reputation had already suffered. Because of his part in exposing the corruption, Keller was the center of attention and received both praise and rejection. While some co-workers subtly showed their support, others shunned him, remaining faithful to the old guard. Keller was unconcerned. It was sufficient that he had done the right thing. Talia met Keller in a tiny cafe on the outskirts of town a week after she was freed. In sharp contrast to the pandemonium they had already experienced, the mood was calm, almost tranquil. Sitting opposite her, Keller fidgets with his coffee cup. He said softly, "I wasn't sure you'd show up." With a little smile on her lips, Talia lifted an eyebrow. "You deserve this talk," she said. "You did something that very few people would have done." Keller's countenance was uncertain as he glanced down at the table. He said, "I just couldn't keep looking the other way. To be honest, though, I'm not sure if it made a difference. People like Carter and Sullivan are increasingly prevalent, and the department is still in disarray." Talia firmly responded, "It made a difference to the people they hurt. Additionally, don't undervalue the impact it had on you." For the first time, he allowed himself a tiny smile as her comments seemed to relieve some of his strain. "How about you?" he inquired. "Now what?" Talia's look was unreadable as she reclined on her chair. "I'm going to the next quest now. Another fight is constantly coming." Their fates were decided when Carter and Sullivan appeared in court months later. They each received significant prison sentences after entering guilty pleas to several offenses. Their reputations were ruined, and their careers were done. They had to deal with the repercussions of their conduct for the first time. Innocent persons were cleared, and the cases they had based on false information were overturned. Using the incident as a spur, community leaders united for more extensive reforms. Talia was sitting quietly, packing a little bag in her bare apartment. On the table, a folder containing information about her next task was open. She gave it a quick glance before shutting it, her thoughts already fixed on the path ahead. She picked up the buzzing phone on the counter. The voice of Agent Price reached the end of the line. "Are you prepared for the next one?" Talia gave a small smile. "Always." The door clicked behind her as she stepped out into the cool evening air. The battle was far from over. Not for herself or the others she was trying to keep safe. For the time being, though, she gave herself a silent moment of contentment. The truth had won out and justice had been done, and it was sufficient for her. Consequently, justice was done and the truth was revealed. The dishonest police officers who believed they could escape punishment were held accountable. In contrast, the woman they attempted to frame won, more powerful than before. This tale serves as a reminder that the truth will always come to light, regardless of how profound the lies are. Remember to click the subscribe button and enable notifications if you like this story and would like to hear more captivating stories like this one. Your assistance is invaluable and makes these tales come to life. I appreciate you viewing, and I hope to see you in the future one.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.